16 years. That's how long I spent preparing the dead in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. 16 years of embalming fluid and porcelain tables, of consoling grieving families and reconstructing what car accidents had torn apart. My name is Daniel Garrett, and until last month, I was one of the most experienced morticians at Whitestone Memorial Funeral Home. Licensed, certified by the American Board of Funeral Service Education, with a mortuary science degree from Mount Ida College, and over 3,000 embalmings to my name. People always asked me how I could do this work, how I could spend my days with the dead without it affecting me. The truth is, I loved it. There's a profound dignity in preparing someone for their final goodbye, in giving families one last chance to see their loved one at peace. I'd handled everything: the peaceful passings, the violent ends, the decomposed bodies found weeks too late, highway fatalities where I had to rebuild faces from fragments, burn victims, homicides that left me working late into the night just to make the person look human again. Nothing shook me. Nothing made me question whether I was in the right profession. Until October 14th of last year, I would have told you I understood death completely. I would have explained the science of it with absolute confidence. The cooling of the body, the onset of rigor mortis, the cellular breakdown that begins the moment the heart stops. I thought I knew exactly where the line was between life and death, and I was certain that line was clear, definable, and permanent. Now I know better. Now I know that everything they taught me in mortuary school, every principle I built my career on, every assumption I made about the nature of death itself, all of it was incomplete at best. In the case that showed me this truth, the one that made me walk away from 16 years of work without looking back, is something I've documented, verified with witnesses, and still cannot begin to explain. This is that story. And I need you to understand something before I tell it. I'm not someone who believes in ghost stories or paranormal nonsense. I'm a man of science, of documented procedures, and measurable results. Which is exactly why what I witnessed in the prep room of Whitestone Memorial destroyed everything I thought I knew about my profession. Whitestone Memorial has been operating in Cedar Rapids since 1968, housed in a converted Victorian mansion on First Avenue East. The building maintains its original architectural charm, with modern embalming facilities in the basement, 3 viewing parlors on the first floor, and administrative offices on the second. Our prep room contains 2 porcelain embalming tables, industrial sinks, a hydro aspirator for cavity treatment, and every chemical and instrument required for thorough body preparation. We maintain strict protocols, detailed documentation, and professional standards that exceed state requirements. It was October 14th of last year when everything changed. I remember because it was a Tuesday, and I'd just returned from my daughter's parent-teacher conference, feeling optimistic about her progress in 5th grade. The autumn evening had turned cold, temperatures dropping into the low 40s, and a steady rain drummed against the prep room windows as I reviewed the intake schedule for the week. My colleague, Nathan Cole, our other full-time mortician, had left at 5 o'clock for his son's soccer game. I was alone in the building, except for our night receptionist, Margaret Sullivan, stationed upstairs at the front desk. At 6:47 that evening, Margaret called down to inform me that St. Luke's Hospital was sending over a transfer. Male, age 34, named David Foster, pronounced dead at 5:15 that afternoon from what preliminary reports indicated was sudden cardiac arrest. No family had arrived yet, but they'd be coming in the following morning to make arrangements. Standard procedure dictated I'd receive the body, perform a basic examination, document any visible marks or conditions, assign a case number, and refrigerate until the family consultation determined our course of action. The hospital transport arrived at 7:09. I met the 2 attendants, Jason Miller and Rebecca Torres, at our service entrance. I'd worked with both of them dozens of times over the years. They wheeled in a standard black body bag on a gurney, transferred it to our stainless steel transport cart, and I signed the custody forms. Nothing unusual in their demeanor, no whispered warnings or strange comments. Just another routine transfer on a rainy October night. I brought the cart into the prep room, locked the door per protocol, and positioned it beside embalming table 1 under the bright surgical lights. The temperature in the prep room holds steady at 62 degrees year-round to slow decomposition. I pulled on fresh nitrile gloves, positioned my clipboard for notes, and unzipped the body bag. David Foster appeared remarkably peaceful. Caucasian male, approximately 5 feet 11 inches tall, lean build around 170 pounds. Brown hair cut short, clean shaven, no visible tattoos on his arms or neck. He wore a wrinkled blue dress shirt and dark slacks, presumably what he'd been wearing when he collapsed at work. His skin showed the typical pallor of recent death, though without the waxy quality that develops after several hours. Lips slightly parted, eyes closed, hands resting naturally at his sides. I began my standard external examination, speaking observations aloud from my digital recorder, as I always did. No signs of trauma to the head, face, or neck. No defensive wounds on the hands or arms. No indication of medical intervention beyond a small adhesive pad on his left forearm where an IV had been placed. Body temperature cool to the touch, consistent with approximately 2.5 hours post-mortem. Rigor mortis just beginning to set in the smaller muscle groups of the jaw and fingers, exactly as expected for this timeline. I was noting the condition of his fingernails, checking for any debris that might indicate a struggle or fall when his left hand twitched. I stepped back instinctively, my heart rate spiking. But I've seen this before. Post-mortem muscle spasms are uncommon but documented. Residual electrical impulses in nerve tissue can cause movements hours after death. I'd witnessed fingers curl, eyelids flutter, even an entire arm shift position during preparation. Unsettling for the uninitiated, but explainable through basic biology. I returned to my examination, documenting his clothing and preparing to undress him for a more thorough assessment. As I unbuttoned his shirt, I noticed something odd about his chest. It was rising and falling, not dramatically, not in the rapid pattern of someone breathing normally, but subtle movements, maybe 3 or 4 seconds apart, as if he were taking slow, shallow breaths. I immediately placed my hand flat on his sternum. Nothing. No movement beneath my palm. I watched his chest again, still, completely motionless. I must have imagined it, I told myself, a trick of the overhead lights creating shadows that suggested movement where none existed. But then I felt warmth beneath my hand. I pulled away and grabbed my infrared thermometer from the equipment tray, the same device I used to monitor body temperatures during embalming to ensure proper chemical saturation. I aimed it at David Foster's forehead and pressed the trigger. The digital display flickered and showed 94.3 degrees Fahrenheit. That was impossible. Absolutely impossible. Human body temperature drops approximately 1.5 degrees per hour after death, faster in cool environments. David had been pronounced dead almost 3 hours ago. He should be measuring somewhere in the mid to low 80s at this point, possibly cooler given the hospital's morgue storage and transport conditions. There was no conceivable explanation for a temperature of 94 degrees. I took 3 more readings, 94.1, 94.4, 93.9, all clustered in a range that suggested a living person suffering from mild hypothermia, not a deceased individual cooling toward room temperature. My hands shook as I reached for my stethoscope. I'd used this instrument on hundreds of bodies, always confirming what the hospital had already documented. Silence. No heartbeat, no breath sounds, no biological function. I placed the chest piece against David Foster's chest, holding my own breath to eliminate any ambient noise. Silence. Complete and total silence. No heartbeat, no respiratory sounds. Nothing. I moved the stethoscope to different positions across his chest, checking all the standard locations for cardiac activity. Still nothing. I checked his carotid pulse, pressing my fingers firmly against his neck. No pulse. I held my hand above his nose and mouth, feeling for any breath. No air movement. By every standard measurement I knew, every test I'd been trained to perform, David Foster was dead. His hospital paperwork confirmed death. The attending physician had signed the pronouncement. The state death certificate was being processed. He had no heartbeat, no respiration, no response to stimuli, but his body temperature was 94 degrees and climbing. I took another temperature reading 15 minutes later, 95.7 degrees, another 15 minutes after that, 96.2 degrees, His body was warming up, moving in the exact opposite direction that every corpse I'd ever handled had moved. The dead grow cold. That's not philosophy or metaphor, it's biological certainty. Yet here, documented with a calibrated medical instrument, was evidence that contradicted everything I understood about postmortem processes. I called Nathan Cole at 8:35, interrupting his evening to ask him to come back to the funeral home. He arrived 27 minutes later, still wearing his son's soccer team sweatshirt, and I walked him through everything I'd observed. Nathan has been in this profession for 19 years, longer than me, and I've seen him handle situations that would break most people. He listened without interrupting, his expression neutral and professional. Then he conducted his own examination. He checked the paperwork, verified the identity, took temperature readings, listened for cardiac activity, and tested for reflexes. When he finished, he looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Genuine confusion mixed with something that might have been fear. "This doesn't make any sense," he said quietly. "Everything says deceased, but the temperature..." He trailed off, taking another reading. 97.1 degrees now. "We need to call the hospital." We contacted St. Luke's Hospital at 9:03. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the emergency room physician who'd pronounced David Foster dead, answered after we were transferred through their system. I explained the situation as clearly as possible, trying to keep my voice steady and professional. I described the rising body temperature, the absence of vital signs, the complete contradiction between what our instruments were telling us. Dr. Mitchell was silent for several seconds after I finished. Then she said, "Mr. Garrett, I personally examined David Foster. I performed all standard tests for determining death. He had no cardiac activity, no respiratory effort, no neurological function. His pupils were fixed and dilated. His skin showed dependent lividity. I watched the monitor flatline for 6 continuous minutes before calling time of death. There is absolutely no question that he was deceased when he left this hospital." "I understand that, doctor," I replied. "But I'm documenting a core body temperature of 97 degrees right now, 3 hours and 45 minutes after death. That's not possible with a deceased person." Another long pause. "Have you checked your equipment? Calibrated your thermometer recently?" "Calibrated it 3 weeks ago. It's functioning perfectly. I've taken over a dozen readings with consistent results." "Mr. Garrett, what you're describing is medically impossible. If this individual is warming up and has no vital signs, then either your equipment is malfunctioning or... I don't know what else to tell you. Bodies don't do what you're describing." We ended the call with an agreement that I'd continue monitoring and contact them immediately if any change occurred. Nathan and I took shifts throughout the night, one of us staying in the prep room with David Foster at all times, taking temperature readings every 15 minutes, checking for any sign of cardiac or respiratory activity, documenting everything with photographs and detailed notes. By midnight, his body temperature had reached 98.2 degrees, normal human body temperature for a living person. By 1:15 in the morning, it was 98.9. Slight fever range, and still no heartbeat, no breathing, no pulse, no response to any stimulus. We tried verbal commands, physical touch, even a sternum rub, a painful pressure technique used to check responsiveness. Nothing. David Foster remained completely unresponsive, while his body inexplicably warmed itself in defiance of every principle of biology I'd ever learned. At 2:33 in the morning, his eyes opened. Not slowly, not with the flutter and confusion of someone waking from sleep. His eyelids simply opened, and he was staring directly at the ceiling with perfectly clear, focused eyes. Brown eyes, I noted absurdly, because that's what you document when you've been trained to observe and record details. His pupils were normal-sized, reactive to the overhead lights, not the fixed and dilated pupils that Dr. Mitchell had documented 4 hours earlier. Nathan stumbled backward, knocking over an instrument tray that clattered across the floor. I stood frozen, my logical mind trying to process what I was witnessing, while every instinct screamed at me to run. David Foster didn't move beyond his opened eyes. He didn't turn his head, didn't lift his arms, didn't attempt to sit up. He just stared upward with an expression of such profound emptiness that it was more unsettling than if he'd started screaming. No fear, no confusion, No recognition of where he was or what had happened to him. Just vacant awareness, if such a thing could exist. I found my voice, though it came out hoarse and uncertain. "David, can you hear me?" No response. Not even a flicker of acknowledgement that I'd spoken. Nathan had backed against the far wall, his face pale. "Daniel, this isn't possible. We need to call 911. We need to call the hospital back. We need to..." "And tell them what?" I interrupted. "That a man who's been legally declared dead for 9 hours just opened his eyes but has no heartbeat or breathing? They'll think we're having a breakdown." But Nathan was already pulling out his phone, dialing. I listened as he reported the situation to the emergency dispatcher, his voice shaking but clear. The dispatcher sounded skeptical, asked clarifying questions, but ultimately agreed to send an ambulance. They arrived 12 minutes later. 2 paramedics named Michael Rodriguez and Jennifer Park, who I'd also worked with before. They entered the prep room with their equipment, took one look at David Foster lying motionless on the table with his eyes open, and their professional composure faltered. Michael approached cautiously and immediately reached for his stethoscope while Jennifer prepared the portable heart monitor. "No pulse," Michael announced after 30 seconds of checking. "No respirations. Jennifer, get the monitor on him." She attached the electrodes to his chest and we all watched the screen. Flatline. Perfect, unbroken flatline. No cardiac activity whatsoever. Jennifer increased the sensitivity, adjusted the leads and checked every connection. Still nothing. The monitor confirmed what our stethoscopes had already told us. David Foster had no heartbeat. "But his eyes are open," Jennifer said, stating the obvious because sometimes you have to voice the impossible thing just to confirm you're actually seeing it. "And his skin is warm. Michael, feel his arm." Michael touched David's forearm and jerked his hand back as if burned. "He's warm. Body temperature feels normal. How is that possible?" I showed them our documentation. The temperature logs stretching back hours, showing the progressive warming from the mid-80s into normal human range. I showed them the hospital death certificate. I explained everything we'd observed, speaking quickly because I needed them to believe me. Needed someone else to confirm that we weren't losing our minds. Michael looked at Jennifer. Jennifer looked at the monitor. They both looked at David Foster, who continued staring at the ceiling with those empty, aware eyes. "We need to transport him," Michael finally said. "I don't know what's happening here, but this is beyond anything I've encountered. Let's get him back to St. Luke's." They transferred David onto their gurney, loaded him into the ambulance, and left at 3:21 in the morning. Nathan and I stood in the now empty prep room, surrounded by our abandoned instruments and scattered notes, trying to process what had just occurred. 16 years, Nathan said quietly. 16 years I've been doing this work, Daniel. I've never seen anything like that, not even close. Neither had I. Not in any textbook, any professional journal, any conference or training seminar. What we'd witnessed fell completely outside the boundaries of known science, and I had no framework for understanding it. The hospital called back at 6:15 that morning. Dr. Mitchell herself, her voice tight with something I couldn't quite identify. "Mr. Garrett, we've been examining David Foster for 3 hours. He shows no vital signs, no cardiac activity, no respiratory effort, no neurological responses. But his body temperature remains in the normal range. His eyes are open and reactive to light, and his tissues show no signs of cellular breakdown. We've consulted with every specialist on staff. Nobody has an explanation. This contradicts everything we understand about human physiology." "What are you going to do with him?" I asked. "I don't know. He's legally dead. We have a death certificate, but he's also clearly not decomposing, and something is maintaining his body temperature. We're keeping him under observation, running every test we can think of. I'll update you if anything changes." I went home that morning as dawn broke over Cedar Rapids, my hands still shaking, and I couldn't explain to my wife Sarah what had happened. How do you tell someone that you witnessed something impossible? That the fundamental principles of your profession had been violated by a corpse with no heartbeat, but open eyes and normal body temperature? I tried to sleep but couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw David Foster staring at the ceiling with that terrible emptiness. At noon, I gave up on rest and returned to Whitestone Memorial to complete paperwork and prepare for the next day's scheduled services. Nathan was already there, looking as exhausted as I felt. "The hospital called again," he said. "David Foster's family arrived this morning. They're completely confused about what's happening. The hospital is calling in specialists from Iowa City and trying to figure out if they need to revoke the death certificate. This is going to be all over the news, Daniel. We're going to have reporters asking questions we can't answer." But that's not what happened. 3 days later, David Foster died. Again. Officially, finally, and this time, with no ambiguity. Dr. Mitchell called to inform me that at 4:37 in the afternoon on October 17th, his body temperature had suddenly dropped, his eyes closed, and all the inexplicable signs of whatever had been sustaining him simply ceased. He became what he should have been all along, a deceased individual whose body followed the normal patterns of postmortem change. The hospital conducted an autopsy. The results were inconclusive. The pathologist, Dr. Raymond Torres, found evidence of the cardiac arrest that had initially killed him, scarring in the heart tissue suggesting a massive infarction. But he found no explanation for the 3 days of maintained body temperature, no reason the tissue hadn't begun breaking down, no rational cause for any of what had occurred. The family held a quiet funeral service. David Foster was cremated, as he'd indicated in his advance directives. The death certificate listed the cause of death as sudden cardiac arrest, dated October 14th, with no mention of the impossible days that followed. The story never made the news. The hospital administration apparently decided it was better to let the case fade into obscurity rather than invite questions nobody could answer. But I couldn't let it fade. I spent weeks reviewing my documentation, double-checking every detail, making sure I hadn't made some fundamental error in my observations or recordings. Everything was accurate. Everything was witnessed and confirmed by Nathan, by the paramedics, by hospital staff. David Foster had been deceased with no vital signs, but had somehow maintained body temperature and opened his eyes for 72 hours before finally succumbing to the death that should have claimed him 3 days earlier. And then it happened again. December 3rd, female victim, age 47, named Rebecca Thornton. Car accident fatality, pronounced dead at the scene by emergency responders at 9:30 in the morning. Massive trauma to the chest and head, injuries incompatible with life. She arrived at Whitestone Memorial at 2 in the afternoon, and I performed the initial examination with a sense of dread that I couldn't quite articulate. Everything seemed normal at first. Body temperature at 81 degrees, consistent with 5 hours post-mortem. Rigor mortis establishing appropriately. No heartbeat, no respiration, no neurological response. I documented her injuries, photographed the trauma, and prepared to begin reconstruction work that would allow for an open casket service if the family desired. At 4:15, I checked her body temperature again as part of routine monitoring. 86 degrees, 5-degree increase in just over 2 hours. My stomach dropped. I took 3 more readings. 86.2, 86.4, 86.1, all showing the same impossible warming pattern I documented with David Foster. I called Nathan immediately. He arrived within 20 minutes, and together we watched as Rebecca Thornton's body temperature climbed steadily through the evening. By midnight, she was at 95 degrees. By 3 in the morning, 98.1. And at 4:47, her eyes opened. We'd already contacted the hospital. We'd already alerted Dr. Mitchell, who'd driven to our funeral home personally this time. She examined Rebecca Thornton with trembling hands and confirmed what we already knew. No vital signs, no cardiac activity, no respiration, but a body that was defying death through mechanisms we couldn't begin to understand. "This is the second time," Dr. Mitchell whispered, more to herself than to us. 2 cases in less than 2 months. Same impossible presentation. Same complete violation of biological principles. What the hell is happening? None of us had an answer. Rebecca Thornton remained in our prep room for 4 days before her body temperature dropped and she finally died again, just like David Foster. The autopsy found catastrophic injuries that should have resulted in instant death, and no explanation for the days of impossible persistence that followed. I documented everything. I wrote detailed reports, collected data, contacted other funeral homes and hospitals to ask if they'd ever encountered similar cases. Nobody had. These two incidents appeared to be unique, isolated events that defied explanation and refused to fit into any known framework of medical science or mortuary practice. But they destroyed me nonetheless. Every time I entered the prep room, I wondered if the next body would warm up instead of cooling down. Every time I examined a deceased individual, I found myself checking for signs that death wasn't quite as final as I'd always believed. My sleep suffered, my relationships strained. My confidence in my own professional judgment crumbled because I'd witnessed things that my training insisted were impossible. Last month, I drafted a letter to the owner of Whitestone Memorial explaining that I would be stepping away from the profession. I didn't mention David Foster or Rebecca Thornton in my official explanation. I cited burnout, family considerations, a desire to pursue other opportunities, all the standard reasons people leave difficult jobs. But the truth was simpler and more disturbing. I could no longer trust my understanding of death, and a mortician who doubts the fundamental nature of their work has no business continuing in the profession. My last day was March 15th. I cleaned out my office, said goodbye to colleagues who couldn't understand why I was walking away from a successful career, and drove home knowing I'd never return to that prep room where I'd witnessed the impossible. Nathan Cole still works at Whitestone Memorial. He calls me occasionally, usually late at night when he's finished a shift and needs to talk to someone who understands what we experience. Neither of us has answers. Neither of us can explain what we saw or why it happened to those two individuals, and, as far as we know, nobody else. But here's what keeps me awake now, months after leaving mortuary work behind. Here's the question that haunts me more than the memory of David Foster's empty eyes or Rebecca Thornton's impossible warmth. How many other cases have there been that nobody noticed? How many times has death loosened its grip for a few hours or days while a body lay alone in a morgue or funeral home, with nobody present to observe the impossible warming, the eyes that opened in empty rooms, the persistence of something beyond our understanding? I've prepared over 3,000 bodies in my career. I followed protocols, documented conditions, performed my duties with professional competence and care. But I was rarely alone with the deceased for extended periods. I checked temperatures at initial examination, and then periodically during embalming preparation, but not continuously throughout the night. I didn't maintain hour-by-hour monitoring of every individual who passed through our facility. What did I miss? What did we all miss? How many times have the dead lingered in that strange space between life and final death while we went about our professional routines, never suspecting that something extraordinary was occurring just beyond our awareness? I don't know. I'll never know. But I do know that death isn't as simple or as final as I believed for 16 years. There's something else happening in that transition, something we don't understand and maybe aren't meant to understand. And that knowledge, that certainty that everything I was taught was incomplete at best and fundamentally wrong at worst is why I couldn't continue in the profession. I still see them sometimes in my dreams. David Foster staring at the ceiling with those empty brown eyes. Rebecca Thornton's chest rising and falling without breath, her body radiating warmth without life. They haunt me not because they were terrifying in the traditional sense, but because they represented an impossible truth that I can never unlearn. Somewhere right now in funeral homes and hospital morgues across Iowa and the entire country, bodies are cooling on steel tables and in refrigerated drawers. Morticians are performing embalmings. Pathologists are conducting autopsies. Families are making arrangements for services. Everyone operating under the assumption that death is a single, definable moment. The instant when the heart stops and the brain shuts down, and the person who inhabited that body is simply gone. But what if we're wrong? What if death is a process we don't fully comprehend, with stages and variations we've never properly documented because we weren't looking for them? What if some people linger in that transition, neither alive nor truly deceased, held in suspension by forces we can't measure or explain? I left the funeral industry because I couldn't continue working with that uncertainty. I couldn't prepare another body without wondering if it might warm up instead of cooling down, if dead eyes might open and stare through me at something I couldn't perceive. The confidence required to perform mortuary work properly, the absolute certainty that you're handling deceased individuals who are beyond suffering and awareness, had been shattered by two impossible cases that I witnessed, documented, and still cannot explain. My daughter asked me last week why I changed careers. She's only 11, too young to understand the full truth, so I told her I wanted to spend more time with the family and needed a change after so many years in such demanding work. But the real answer is much simpler and infinitely more disturbing. I left because I saw two people who should have been dead, but weren't. Not completely, not for days afterward. I left because modern medicine and mortuary science have no explanation for what I witnessed. I left because somewhere in funeral homes tonight, bodies are lying on preparation tables, and we have no way of knowing which ones might open their eyes in the empty hours before dawn, staring at nothing with impossible awareness while their cooling flesh inexplicably warms itself back toward life. And I left because after everything I've seen, everything I've documented and witnessed and can never forget, I finally understand one terrible truth. We don't actually know what death is. We just pretend we do until something impossible proves us wrong. And by then, it's far too late to admit we never really understood any of it at all.